This is the kind of first in a resuscitated series of Transforming the Future webinars, and really pleased to be able to start with this wonderful duo of Claire and Sarah on a topic that is fascinating and crucial, something that is essential for us in the context of the work we're doing around futures literacy. I just want to provide a little word of background about the Transforming the Future seminars, which is to say that these seminars are meant to explore the many different avenues and byways and passages that relate to how people think about the future, use the future to explore the anticipatory systems and processes in the world around us. And we expect that it'll be a very wide open series of webinars that will invite many people from different perspectives and with different experiences and points of view. But fundamentally, I think the idea is to provide a platform to share the growing understanding that we have of the crucial role that anticipation and anticipatory systems and processes play in the way in which humans perceive and act in the world. So without further ado, I will turn the floor over to our fearless duo, who have written this fabulous book and have provided us, I think, with really a wonderful window on a whole field of thinking that's of direct relevance to the work that's going on here at UNESCO, and I'm sure worldwide. So over to you, Sarah, Claire.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Real, and it's really a great pleasure to be taking part in this series. So the way that we thought we'd do it, and Sarah will at any point leap in if she thinks otherwise, is I will do a brief introduction to the book and to the ideas about story listening as a whole. So bear with it, because as it were, the plot builds, and I'll talk around the functions of story, which is in our language synonymous with narrative, and then Sarah will come in with the real thrust around futures and around anticipation. But that only makes sense if you've gone a short distance with us in really reorientating for many people how you think about story and about narrative. And I think the other thing worth saying is just that you'll tell, but I come at this really as a practitioner, or as a former practitioner, having worked in science advice in government and in futures in government, and Sarah very much as a scholar of literature. Is that a fair? And public humanities. Brilliant. Right. Now I will start by attempting to share a screen. Now, that's good. Okay, lovely. Story listening. The drive here comes from the fact that stories are very widely taken to matter. They're constantly being spoken of as important. But actually, when it comes to public reasoning, there's much less questioning about exactly how or why or what to do about the fact that they matter. And some of this is often tied up with a kind of a fear, perhaps, of their unruly power, that a powerful story is so often the thing that's going to be persuasive or to change the world, and that a powerful narrative in full flow is something that's kind of unstoppable and cannot be reasoned with, and whether it's presented as fiction or non-fiction, that it'll take over, and then sort of cognition and rationality go out of the wall. You can feel the former scientist in me in the language I'm using, I think, to express these fears, but they're kind of widely held in evidence-based public reasoning. Another challenge is that because they're so pervasive in sort of individual humanity and in societal sort of functioning, that thinking about them typically is done in different ways in very, very many different disciplines. And what we wanted to do was to draw on the immense and exciting different approaches to thinking about story and the power of story, and to build something that actually made those different sorts of understanding, threw them together and made it possible to stare stories in the eye, as it were, and think about the kind of evidence that they provide. So I want to move on, and it's not moving on. There we go. So story listening then is a new word, but if you think about it, you've almost certainly used in English language speaking storytelling as a single word. And one of the things to get right at the start is this is not, if you want a seminar on telling stories and how to be persuasive and how to tell better stories, this is not it. This is about listening. And what story listening is this process of both theoretically and practically of gathering together the evidence that is in stories, and it's absolutely complementary. We've had in sort of early discussions the kind of a fear again that maybe this is somehow instead of scientific evidence or social scientific evidence or other forms of evidence. Absolutely isn't. It's in addition. So it's listening, not telling. The other thing is, and particularly because stories are things that we all grow up with and are linked to our own individual identity, to remember this process is thinking about stories and their cognitive value. So it's not does watching the Terminator scare me or make me excited or scared. It's what is it potentially saying about models of the world and other things which I'll go on to talk about. So it's about the cognitive rather than the emotional impacts of stories. I mean, it's also about the collective rather than the individual. So what we're not saying in this is if you told a good story about the future to a particular government leader, that would transform them into a better human being who intuitively understood things better. That's not the issue here. It's about the collective impacts and effects of stories. So, what's the approach? Well, what we wanted to describe is a fourfold framework, which is the framework that enables this value, this cognitive value of stories and the evidence to be gathered. And there are four functions in these collective and cognitive modes. And this first one is points of view. I love a good chart. So here's a chart. And what this is basically saying is that one of the functions of stories is to create multiple ways of examining a system, if you like, a target system. And in policy language, this is very much associated with framing. So you have at stake a target system. It might be a zero carbon ecosystem, or it might be the operations of a city during a pandemic or whatever, but it's a target system, something complex in which you have interest. Typically, a single author or single viewer, this is I, the imbiber, the person who's reading or viewing or listening to a story, has a point of view on that system, and they'll see some things more than others, and there are some things they probably won't see. In imbibing a story, then typically the imbiber gets different perspectives, different points of view on that system. They might actually inhabit the mind of a villain, if it's a humanoid character, or it might be a tree or a river, or it might be a distributed thing like a distributed intelligence. But together they are creating multiple points of view on the target system, which then scaled up might create a different sort of perspective and description of the system, which in turn changes the framing of the policy or the political matter or the public reasoning. The second, and I'm going quite briefly through them, but there's lots of time for discussion later. The second is around the functioning of stories in terms of creating and making enhancing understanding of collective identities. And this is essentially about both the content of stories, but also the sharing of them in ways that may be free of the content, may simply be the function of sharing. And to give a couple of examples, the novel Flight Behaviour by Barbara Kingsolver looks at the functioning of a particular aspect of understanding around climate change, but it does it from the perspective of both scientists and non-scientists, people living on the land, and so on, or Zaytoon, in which the central character is both a scientist, is both an entrepreneur and a family member, and a member of an ethnic minority, and so on. And stories in this sense are giving paths through collective sets of collective identities. And of course, for any of us, and for any of us on this call, we're also parts of different collective identities that are framed or partly connected by and created by the stories that we share. So the questions then are perhaps around those of some work that Sarah did on AI researchers, artificial intelligence researchers, or as we mentioned in a small case study in the book, the IPCC's special 1.5 degree special report, which has a large number of authors, and they come from some groups. That absolutely does not deny the power of what those groups are doing. It's just saying that there may be additional ways of thinking about whatever the challenge is that are more easily visible through other groups as well. So that's the second of the 4 functions. And then the third is modelling, and this was actually particularly important for somebody like me. I come at this partly through having worked on quantitative modelling, computational modelling in the context of public reasoning, so computer models, epidemiological models, the kinds of really powerful abstractions of complex systems, of complex human or physical systems, that are ones where governments and researchers spend large amounts of money trying better to abstract and to model particular properties. But of course, these always are artificial. In some sense, every model is a fiction, and if it wasn't a fiction, then it wouldn't be useful, because the real world is the real world and too complicated to think about in any sort of abstract sense. So just as, for example, the novels of Jane Austen will give a simplified, abstracted, or functional model of parts of British society in the 18th century. So a model like, or a novel like Kim Stanley Robinson's Aurora is providing a model of a zero waste community, in this case in a spaceship, and Sarah will talk more about how different kinds of readings can be used to understand better different abstractions, and we think this is one of the helpful ways of beginning to enable surrogate reasoning about the future. And on this slide here, you've also got a model which is an abstraction of a flooding system, and a different type of model again. So in some sense, what we're looking to is extend the notion of ensembles of models, which is quite a commonplace notion in climate change, not just to be ensembles of computational models, but to include different types of qualitative models as well. And then the 4th function is anticipation, which is obviously the one that we're going to come back to in much greater detail, and thinking about ways in which to broaden the range of tools for rigorous thinking about the future, rigorous reasoning about the future. Robert Schiller, on the bottom there, an economist Nobel laureate's narrative economics, is an exploration of how largely non-fictional story sharing actually changes the behaviours of markets, and that's linked then to anticipation of markets and the kind of behaviours of them. There was work on literature around before the most recent economic crash that suggests that some of the ways in which it might have been possible to have listened to stories about economic and market systems functioning could have helped to have reframed thinking about what was going on then, what resilience meant, and what risks might be there. So our arguments here are that the kind of thoughtful abstraction and consideration of rigorous ways of thinking about the future through stories is again complementary. I couldn't resist including quite an old study, the Foresight one from the Government Office for Science in the UK, which employed a novelist to write short stories about the apparently quite, potentially quite boring subject of exploiting the electromagnetic spectrum. And she's now a absolutely best-selling novelist. So there we go. That was ahead of our time in that sense. But we'll move on. So those are 4 functions. So the points of view, the collective identities, the models, and the anticipation. Cutting across those are some other things that are really important for reasoning and thinking about the future. In particular, the way in which charismatic stories draw attention towards themselves and away from the spaces around them, and linked to things like narrative lock-in, to the tendency for debates and indeed for people to get caught in particular sets of stories and models and cognitive and research patterns that might then be excluding others that might be more fruitful. And systematic story listening of the kind that we're talking about would be a way not only of foregrounding and thinking through the charismatic stories which are immediately visible, but also those which are around, which are much less listened to, but also then those which are hardly visible at all. I'll go on briefly then to think through what this means in terms of how story listening might happen, and starting here with narrative literacy. So and I know Real and others talk a lot about futures literacy, and I think we tend to mean a shorthand for some modes of thought that might really liberate and empower people to reason and to explore the world differently. For us, narrative literacy and narrative expertise would be the things that would mean that decision makers or policy makers would call for expertise around stories rather than dismissing them or fearing them or being seduced by them. And by the way, remember, stories in this context could be a computer model as much as it could be a novel or a film or a piece of rhetoric. But literacy and expertise help balance against that. And the other is to extend the systems to naturally incorporate that, and then really to evolve the humanities who could help with developing this sort of evidence. So narrative literacy, I mentioned the Terminator, which is one of the things that drew me into working with Sarah, because when I was involved in some work on AI and its future at the Royal Society and elsewhere, lots of thinking going into the technical questions around what artificial intelligence and machine learning might mean. And then when, as often was the case, the sober science was presented alongside this the robot picture, there was quite a sort of almost a dismissive set of very contradictory responses. Some scientists would say, well, it's fiction, so it's completely irrelevant. But at the same time, people would say, well, it's worrying that these notions of the future of AI are often juxtaposed with this fearsome robot, because humanoid, it'll distort people's anticipation. It'll make them think that AI is closer to creating human intelligence than it actually is, or that it's always going to be malign, or whatever. And so part of our argument is that by being more literate, we could at least ask questions and then begin to draw things out about what stories might actually be saying as they circulate. In terms of structures, this is where beginning to think about how within our existing structures, it might be anything from the IPCC through to, in the UK, a lot more people now have heard of the Scientific Advisory Group in Emergencies, which is the body that comes together and is differently constituted each time there is an emergency. And clearly it's been operating during the pandemic, but actually who's called into the room when a volcano goes up, or there's a big earthquake, or there's some sort of other major emergency? Who is it who does the short-term anticipation, if you like, about what this might mean, and what does it mean for the humanities to be included in that? And in thinking through these kinds of structures, what's needed, what kind of synthesis across what sort of disciplines, what sort of relationship building might actually change and emerge, and that might enable the kind of pluralistic evidence base that we're talking about. And then, and I'm sure Sarah will come back to this, but there's a real challenge here. I've worked a lot, and I'm sure a number of you have, with bringing science into public reasoning and into kind of thoughtful futures. But there are also similar and some newer, some different challenges around bringing humanities and scholars into that sort of space, and particularly perhaps for some of them a need to and be able to think through when and who might want to be engaged in political processes or public reasoning processes, and be inside the room, perhaps being critical, but actually who wants to stand on the side and be an advocate or be an activist. And sometimes different people will make different choices, but you can't actually be both. If you're inside as it were, a room with a decision maker, you may have to trade off then going outside of that room and explaining exactly what was said, because you wouldn't be invited back into the room again if you do that always. So that's a kind of broad introduction to the fourfold framework, and in the in exploring in the book itself, we have a number of performative readings. So I won't go into this; it's very text heavy, but just really to say that you can performatively read, you can explore the stories through non-fiction and fiction. And although we often talk, and I think you'll find questions often come back to fiction, particularly to science fiction, that's partly because it's sometimes more shocking to people to believe, to have to think through what it might mean to take a story badged as fiction seriously and consider its cognitive value. But the same is true of the stories embedded in the kind of models and reports in non-fiction as well. So that's my rapid tour through. Sarah, I think that's where I stop sharing my screen.
Yeah,
and
we
hand
pass
over
the
to you.
baton over. Yeah, so bear with me while we switch screen shares. Are we good? Can I see a thumbs up from Claire? Can you see the screen? Yeah, lovely. Okay, great. So hello everyone, thank you very much for coming. So Claire's given you an overview of story listening and of the kind of key arguments of the book and some of their broader consequences for public reasoning. In the rest of our talk, before we open up to discussion with Riel and with you, which we're very much looking forward to, I wanted to focus on the consequences of story listening, in particular for future studies and practice, obviously in relation to the focus of the webinar series. And this material speaks very much to chapter 4 of the book, which is explicitly on anticipation, but also thinks more widely about the other cognitive functions that Claire's been through connect to anticipation and future studies. This is a brief overview of some of the things that I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about the way in which the story listening framework has direct consequences for future studies by inviting new reflections on the relationship between stories and scenarios, and on the role of narrative within established futures techniques, and on the relationship between future studies and science fiction. As Claire said, one of the novel, perhaps, claims theoretically we make in the book is that narratives can function as anticipatory models in their own right, and I'll spend some time talking about that. And also that narrative evidence is really important if we are serious about decolonizing our thinking about the future, and if we have to contend with shifts, particularly thinking about climate change, away from consideration of end states towards engagement with pathways, recurrent risk and adaptation. So that's a kind of overview of where we're going to go over the next few minutes. So thinking first about stories, scenarios, and what we call narrative futures methods. So stories feature in relation to scenarios in a number of ways. Peter Bishop and his team in 2007 published a really interesting map of different futures methods and techniques, and talk about scenarios as the kind of paradigmatic output of a futures method. And scenarios are either stories in their own right, or they require a story to frame and use them. For instance, if the scenario actually takes a quantitative form, such as a trend database or a strategic plan. So that's one way in which stories intersect with scenarios, but stories also function as futures techniques in their own right. And we gather these practices under this name of narrative future methods, NFMs. And under that title, we're thinking of things like collaborative storytelling games in which stories are created and shared, but we're also thinking about some more established futures methods, backcasting, incasting, future mapping, or to all of which stories are integral and which make use of what we call surrogative reasoning through stories. And the other category to include under narrative futures methods is science fiction prototyping, but also, and I'll come back to this, attention to science fiction and other stories as anticipatory narrative models. So this already embeddedness of stories in future studies means that using the story listening framework, we can explore in more detail how stories are operating as scenarios, how they're operating within and as futures methods, and hopefully in doing so, sophisticate and improve and develop those methods. So to give you a sort of example for any particular method or application of a method, it might be helpful to think, as Claire's pointed to, about how the story's point of view might shift the framing of the debate, or how a story functions to create and connect collective identities, or what model and of what target system the story is functioning in relation to. And here, my discipline of literary studies can also play a role, because insights from narratology, which is the study of the formation and structure of narrative, and from the study of science fiction practices, can really enhance both the creation of narrative scenarios, and existing science fiction stories can be taken seriously as a source of narrative evidence. And coming back to a point that Claire has already mentioned, crucial to all of this are both experts in stories, both story creation and story imbibing or critical story listening, but also more widespread narrative literacy. So this will enable, across a broader spectrum of publics, better understanding of how stories operate in general, how they operate within specific futures methods, and story listening will help bridge from those futures techniques and the scenarios they produce to public engagement and decision making. So basic narrative literacy across all those engaged in futures studies research and practice, including publics and decision makers, would complement, we think, and it'd be interesting to discuss this further with Riel, but would complement more general futures literacy. So a little bit of attention to anticipatory narrative models. I've put on the slide a range of recent initiatives that are starting to take science fiction seriously, but not just science fiction, also more broadly stories, as futures techniques in their own right, or as a source of cognitive value in relation to foresight. And what we do in the book, I hope, is provide a kind of theoretical foundation for why and how we might take such stories seriously. So there's been an interesting historical pattern, if you're looking at least in the Anglo-American tradition, where science fiction and future studies were quite close in the mid-20th century. And then there's been a separation between the two disciplines or schools of thought. And I think they are coming back together again now, because of the need for new and different ways to start thinking about the future and the challenges that we're globally currently facing. So the lack of a contemporary intersection and interaction between future studies and science fiction, I think, needs to be addressed and is starting to be. And understanding stories as anticipatory narrative models is one way to sort of rigorously move this area of connection onwards. So Claire's talked a little bit about models. Models are useful abstractions that enable surrogative reasoning about the world. And scholars such as Mary Morgan, who's based at the London School of Economics, has a wonderful book forthcoming on narrative and science, a collection of scholarly essays. She's written extensively on models and stories as part of scientific models, stories as the kind of what if prompt for quantitative methods. so this is sort of parallels the relationship between stories and scenarios. Stories can play a role in, and do play a role in, existing models, but they can also be understood as models in their own right. And so this is where I think there's a need for literary academics in general, and those specializing in science fiction in particular, to step outside of our disciplines and engage more with futures researchers and practitioners, which is one of the reasons I'm delighted to be here today. Those of us who specialize in studying literature can identify relevant anticipatory narrative models or groups thereof, and our expert engagement with them can unlock them in some way, providing the key to how they relate to the system that they are representing. There's an important point in here to make, which is that no single story necessarily has value as an anticipatory novel and not model in its own right. So we're moving away from the idea of a kind of single story in some way being uniquely predictive. But if you gather narrative evidence from narrative experts across multiple anticipatory narrative models, and if you also story listen to critical engagement with narratives by lay publics and to engagement with narratives in futures techniques, then all of this can produce really valuable narrative evidence that can feed into, as Claire said, a pluralistic evidence base. So narrative futures methods, a final point about them and about anticipatory narrative models in general, also really open up and provide an opportunity for democratizing futures thinking and practice. We all feel like we can grapple with stories, or we understand stories to some extent in a way that we might not feel we can understand complex science. And that's not to say that there isn't expertise needed, but maybe that initial sense of comfort can be used in order to draw publics into thinking about complex science and thinking about complex issues, and thereby creating greater civic participation and engagement and deliberation beyond but together with experts about key questions of our times. So I've talked a little bit about the relationship between future studies and story listening and literature. And now I just want to move to thinking a little bit about what story listening can show and do with respect to futures work. So we've talked about the role stories play in and as scenarios. We've identified a body of future study techniques that can be called narrative futures methods. And we've explored or introduced you to the idea in the book that that stories can function as anticipatory narrative models. So, but what else does the story listening framework allow us to think or say about future studies? Well, one of the really interesting things that it does is, and this is a bit of a kind of meta point, not meta in the sense of Facebook. We can't use that word anymore now. It's been colonized, hasn't it? Meta in the sense of about something. There's a meta point, which is there's a number of stories that model the very practice of future studies. And I think there's a sort of fascinating expert-led review of relevant stories here that are about the role of prediction, about the role of foresight or futures practice in relation to decision making. That review would provide narrative evidence that would inform the development of the field itself, the development of models for future studies and practice, and how it engages with public reason and decision-making bodies. And I've put two examples of this that we talk about in the book. One is Xi Jinlui's The Three-Body Problem, which if you haven't read, you've got a treat in store. I won't go into huge detail about the novel, but the story within the story of the novel is that one of the characters ends up playing a game, which is precisely about a planet called Trisolaris, which is trying to figure out how to predict the unpredictability of its climate because it has three suns, hence the three-body problem. And it's a novel, or the story within the novel is about prediction. It's about science fiction prediction. It's about how you govern under conditions of uncertainty. It's about the importance of still trying to use science to predict, but also where other methods might be needed. So it provides a really interesting model of future studies. And the other one, going further back in time, is Harlan Ellison's short story Soldier, which may or may not be the original text for the Terminator movie. And there's a kind of really nice geeky controversy about that, but which is also a story about a soldier who travels back in time, and they deploy him as a storyteller in order to change policy. And I'm sure there's more. So there's an interesting exercise there that we could do and learn from. Another way to think about this is, and another kind of exercise would be to think about narrative evidence about past futures, which sounds like a kind of oxymoronic thing to say, but it's very difficult to say, you know, now if we listen to this body of stories, if we take evidence from this collection of narratives, you know, this is going to be useful in making decision X. But if we go back in history, and where the future of that history has already happened, we can do a kind of case study analysis of either a situation in which story listening did happen, or a situation in which it didn't, and what might have happened if it had. So there's a kind of alternative history exercise here. So there's a significant kind of research agenda, I think, looking historically at the anticipatory roles of stories and changes in public reasoning over time and place, to gather historical evidence on the relationship between story listening, public reasoning, and different behaviors in different contexts. And considering how to apply story listening to major areas of policy generates a long list of other areas for future research. So, as I said, one could conduct a story listening exercise as it could have been held during a period of public reasoning in the past. So you could almost do a kind of role-playing or contemporary game exercise. You'd need historians, you'd need other experts, you'd need, and these are always my experience of the best and most exciting type of events, an interdisciplinary and cross-sector gathering of individuals. I've said this could happen in relation to, for instance, mid-20th century American nuclear policy decisions, where there was actually quite an intimate and interesting connection between science fiction practitioners, one of whom ended up under house arrest because they thought that he might have been responsible for a leak from the Manhattan Project because of how close his story was. That was the story Deadline. But how about in more recent history, the 2008 financial crisis, the global financial crisis, which two prominent economists in the UK wrote to the Queen when she asked them why nobody saw it coming, and said that it was a collective failure of imagination. But Katie Shaw, who's a colleague of mine who works on literature and economics, makes a strong case in her book Crunchlit that actually if there had been story listening to the collective anticipations of economic narratives in the run-up the couple of decades before the financial crisis, there was a body of imagining there. That recognize the fragility of the systems. Another important consequence, I think, of story listening in relation to anticipation is this idea of decolonizing futures studies. So the idea of the future as open, as not having happened yet, as available for human influence and control, has dominated, but I'd be interested to hear arguments against this, seems to have dominated much of the future study field. But of course, the future is not virgin territory that's ripe for colonization. It's already constrained physically by the laws of nature and by latent futures that in the making. That's a term from Adam and Groves' futures matters, things that have already been put in motion that literally simply cannot be stopped. And coming to the sociological rather than scientific, only some people have the power to decide and act in ways that will significantly influence that future. Some will benefit and some will suffer from that colonization, both in the present and in the future. And another connected point is that the idea of futures, the practice of future studies is often linked with a very Western understanding of the linearity of time. And there's a 2017 issue of World Futures Review, which is on time in the future in a range of national cultures and regions. And Jim Detour in the introduction to that identifies the Western and colonial philosophical underpinnings of future studies. And Kerry Facer in a 2019 essay on story telling and futures really highlights the need to incorporate more decolonial theory. And she points to the work of Boaventura de Sousa Santos and his idea of the epistemologies of the South. And the incorporation of this kind of work into future studies would start to expose the social and the political and the epistemic consequences of, for instance, a linear understanding of time, of the idea of the future as open and empty, of a kind of assumption that anybody has the power to change or influence it. And there's some interesting resonances that I won't go into in detail because I'm restraining the academic bit of me with de Sousa Santos's argument, not least because he talks about the need for deep listening, which of course was a phrase that resonated hugely with us when we read his work. So story listening then can play an important role in this necessary process of decolonizing future studies. And I mean, Sada is the theorist that has been working at this in this area for many, many years. I point here also to the work of Pupil Bisht, who's a relative to Sada, much newer to the field. But the reason I point to her in particular is because of her practice, which is intimately linked with storytelling and with story listening. So stories can offer a different perspective on time. They can model long temporal ranges, and they can offer alternatives to the linear teleological tendency of some futures thinking. And just to link this with something else that's been happening in the UK, and Claire and mine's knowledge is of course very UK based because that's where we are, and with an international audience such as we get at UNESCO, we're very keen to learn from you how this resonates and doesn't resonate with your own experiences. But there's a series that Nesta in the UK has been running called Common Futures, which links with de Sousa Santos's argument that the idea of the South, which is what he's talking about, should be considered as a metaphorical as well as a geographical concept, and that it could describe groups even within the geographic north that are, he says, excluded, silenced, and marginalized populations. And Nesta's initiative is documenting stories by often lower paid and precarious workers in Britain who are going to be directly impacted by technological change, by, for instance, automation, and trying to gather these stories and archive them, but foreground them so that they're heard, and they're heard above or equally to, for instance, the storytelling of entrepreneurs who have a very loud platform for their visions of the future. And if these kinds of stories are not created, or if they're not listened to, public reasoning, both nationally and globally, lacks or misses out on anticipatory narrative models that might really help lead to a wider range of possible futures. And then the last way we think about them interconnecting, and I'll be fairly brief on this one, is the idea of pathway and risk and adaptation. So I've put on the slide the shift that we're seeing in some areas of public reasoning and future studies away from framing the debate about a desired or fixed end state, and more towards thinking about multiple possible pathways, multiple possible timelines, and about the systems or capabilities necessary to manage prolonged uncertainty, and to think about how we live with repeated emergencies or recurrent risks. And with regard to climate change, just one narrative model I would point to is N.K. Jemisin, who's an African-American speculative fiction writer. Her phenomenal trilogy, the Broken Earth trilogy, which consists of these 3 books, which is not just fascinating from a narratological point of view, but really models in interesting ways the type of resilience that is needed when you live on a land, as the people in the book do, where there's recurrent climate catastrophe. And it thinks about things like the importance of local governance and resource structures, about community and trust and allegiance, and about thinking about societal models that place value on the individual's role in the collective, not the individual's own advancement, success, or power. So that's a plug for that series, which I'd heartily suggest you go and have the joy of reading. To finish then, our delineation of story listening in relation to future studies, I hope, provides the conceptual framework to start putting story listening into practice now. And this is something that Claire and I are very eager and keen to do ourselves, and to collaborate with people and to see happen. And we hope it leads to the identification of other types of research that are needed. So I guess the best way to end is with a rallying cry or a call for all innovative and reflective futures practitioners and those who design expert advisory systems to experiment by putting into practice or commissioning story listening exercises as their next projects or within their next projects. Whether the nature of that work is to provide expert analysis direct to decision makers, or whether it's to engage in wider forms of public engagement and democratic deliberation. Thank you. I shall stop sharing my screen and hand back to Riel.
So, wow. Thank you both so much. Unbelievable. Thrilling. I'm really, you know, it's just so exciting. Now, I meant to do something. I actually meant to put your bios in the chat at the very beginning, but now I'm kind of adopting the Netflix or, you know, in television series these days where all the credits come at the end, but it is not quite the end. But I will now put in the chat the absolutely fabulous biographies and links for Sarah and Claire, who are of course spectacular in their careers. And really a wonderful privilege to have you here with us. Let me kick things off, okay? There's a lot to discuss, obviously. But one of the things that struck me, and it's been, I think, something that fascinated me with, you know, what you've been bringing to the conversation right from the beginning, was that when I started thinking about futures literacy, which was actually a long time ago, part of the motivation was that I felt that people had a very hard time coming up with scenarios. So, you know, the classic thing is a little bit to do, well, let's listen to more voices. Let's see what people think about the future. And in fact, you know, as a science fiction reader myself, you know, when am I going to find that science fiction book that steps outside of some of the ways of thinking about the future that are so common? And I was pretty early on struck by what these days I call poverty of the imagination. But of course, there's a part to this which is this inability to listen, and I think it's really fascinating. In other words, you know, I've actually focused for the most part on trying to ramp up people's ability to tell, and the Futures Literacy Labs are in many ways a scaffolding, a cumulative process. And the Futures Literacy Framework is intended to assist precisely with the modeling side of it, which says, you know, each of your anticipatory assumptions are part of the anticipatory part of your model. You've made some narrative assumptions, you've made some analytical assumptions, therefore you can describe the imaginary future, tell various different stories or narratives about that imagined future. But, you know, in your work, and it's been coming to the forefront more and more, you can't even get there because the way I hear, the way I listen to others, and I think, you know, to me this also gets at this question of diversifying epistemic perspectives, which, if you only look at it from the point of view of what's it going to tell me about my way of seeing the world, will not get you where you want to go. How do we get into this side of I mean, I think you've suggested, but in practice, what have you been doing that you think gives people this ability to appreciate the impact of story listening on their framing before they begin telling? You see what I mean? Before they begin constructing, because I've instrumentalized my listening. I know that, and that instrumentalization of my listening has diminished my ability for telling, or for even, you know, perceiving. So, and Futures Literacy Labs are aimed in many ways, and what Pupil does as well is, and much of what the Futures community does is about how do we diversify what we imagine, and then therefore what we describe. But I'm obviously, you know, thrilled by this, you deepening and extending of the challenge. So at a practical level, where do you see this going, and how can we connect the two in a sense? It's a kind of messy, big question, but.
Claire, shall I come back with, as usual, some of the more sort of scholarly thoughts, and then maybe you could come back on some of the practical stuff. As always, Real, you open up so many interesting ideas. I like, so we often get questions about how story listening connects to storytelling, but the questions are normally about stories are evil and persuasive and distort the facts. So how can we take them seriously if we've got all these, untrustworthy storytellers? Or, you're trying to imply that we should include evidence that is unreliable because it's a story in the way in which you conceive of it. You've asked a very different and interesting question, which, if I can sort of rephrase it back to you, what's the impact of story listening before you then start your telling? And I kind of like the temporality of that, because there's always going to be storytelling. There's always going to be the need to communicate. There's always going to be the fact that any form of communication really, no matter what it's communicating, is framed narratively in one way or another. And there's always going to be decision makers and people in positions of authority and power who have to communicate their decisions. I guess, and this might link to the practical application, I guess the point is for story listening to take place at the site of evidence gathering. And evidence gathering isn't about telling. It actually, and Claire has much more experience in this, but evidence gathering is about listening, or it's at least about researching and gathering a range of evidence that can inform your decisions, which then, of course, then will be communicated. And that's where the storytelling comes in. So that's where story listening has to happen. And that's why we talk about narrative evidence. It has to happen as part of the mechanisms of understanding the issue or the system about which you then have to make decisions and about which you then have to communicate. And so Claire can sort of come in on that practical. One more point is I disagree. I know we healthily disagree on lots of things. This is why I enjoy talking with you so much. That there's a poverty of the imagination. I don't think there is. I think what there is, I think there's narrative lock-in and there's narrative deficit. And these are two terms we use in the book. So narrative lock-in, as it sounds, is where you are only engaged with, either consciously or unconsciously, a certain set of narratives. And you do not think or explore beyond those. Narrative deficits is interesting because a narrative deficit, say about a policy issue, could be because there really aren't any stories about it, but actually is most likely to be the fact that those stories that might be relevant simply aren't being heard by the people who are making the decisions. So the task then is to look beyond your lock-in and to check that is there really a narrative deficit? Is there really poverty of the imagination? Or have I only really watched mainstream Hollywood films about AI? So I don't realize that there's actually really sophisticated and interesting thinking in X, Y, or Z writer, or in this initiative that's gathering stories from publics. So that would be where I think the listening comes in, which is the world is full and rich of imagination. The question is who's heard, and how they and whose knowledge, specifically also if it's in narrative form, is taken seriously. So that would be the sort of slight rebuff on that poverty of imagination point. But I'll hand to Claire maybe to talk about the sort of in practice bit.
Thank you. The challenges in this case, in this part of the discussion, is around what in the kind of scientific evidence circles would basically be always referred to, I think, as evidence synthesis. The notion that you don't pick the data that you want, and you don't only look to the places with which you're familiar. You have some set of processes that you bind yourself to, that make it more likely that you will be forced to observe things that you hadn't even known existed and might not like the existence of, you know, like experimental findings that you don't agree with or whatever it might be. So rather, as you wouldn't ever base your climate models only on the places where the surface temperature was hot, so you would in no way think that, to keep with the AI example, artificial general intelligence was the main challenge to be thought about, nor that it was the only available sort of source of narrative, because narratives about distributed artificial intelligences have also existed, fictional ones in this instance as well as non-fictional, for a long time. They have tended to be less popular, and they've tended to be less visible. So you have to sort of, you know, you have to close your mind as far as you can to what is the most maybe the most attractive to you as whoever you are, but certainly what is the most popular. Go out and then have some sort of filtering mechanism, which I'm afraid actually does probably depend on expertise, to say, right, which ones of these might be telling us something useful in this context. And I mean, underlying some of what you said, Riel, quite often comes up a question which is about power as opposed to evidence. And of course they're intertwined, but what we're trying to do is not say, I mean, there's a lot of very legitimate questions about who is in power at any one point, and we're not saying that to listen to a particular set of stories from people in a socio-economically disadvantaged group, or a particular ethnic minority, or whoever it might be, some people who are not powerful, we're not wanting to, in this instance, to give them power. We're just saying, because they're not powerful, it's quite likely that their stories haven't even been taken into account. Let's think about what those stories might mean. That might mean that they end up in a different, more powerful position, or it might not, but we're trying not to start from that position, because to start from that position then actually brings you into evidential challenges. And the classic would be, I mean, at one point, you know, sort of debate with a, you know, very experienced scientific advisor to debates. Essentially, he was worried, wasn't he, that that somehow listening to stories would mean you'd end up in a debate about whether, if people think a volcano is not going to erupt and tell stories about it not erupting, it's therefore necessary to believe it's less likely that it is going to erupt. Whereas, of course, listening to stories about volcanoes potentially erupting or not erupting will give you all sorts of other information, but it doesn't actually alter at the moment whether that volcano would erupt or not. It all gets much more complicated when you get into climate change, because the interplay between people and the physical systems is so much more intertwined. Anyhow, so systematic evidence gathering that in some sense keeps you honest from your own, whoever the you is, predilections and tendencies and group collective identities, to listen to some stories more than others, is the real answer. And then putting that alongside of other forms of evidence, so that you then test whatever the learning you might be, that you might have gained from against other sources.
Okay, I'm gonna open the floor a little bit, but I'm gonna continue my privilege of the chair just for half a sec on this, because it's so, you know, passionate for me about all this. But I mean, you know, in my experience, one of the things that manifests itself all the time is that there's a huge uniformity to the instrumentalization of the future. The future is used for one particular purpose. And the fact that it's used for that purpose, which I call anticipation for the future, is really what I'm talking about when I talk about poverty of the imagination. I'm not talking about the diversity of scenarios and the multiplicity of twists, and I'm not even talking here about the supply side in the sense that or the ability, you know, access, or you know, even I would say, you know, interpretive or translation difficulties, of which obviously there are many. But I'm really talking about what seems to me to be millennia, because I'm including the imperial city of China, you know, the imperial city in China, the the pyramids in Latin America or Egypt or wherever, the monumentalist and basically small g God perspective that we take humanity, this proposition that distances us from the future that takes its shape in some fiction, some indigenous cultures, where the future is simply an orthogonal, disruptive, and it's only the future because it's not now. I mean, it could be the past in a sense. It's just that it's not verifiable in the current context, and therefore it is fundamentally disruptive of what you see in the present. And I still feel that you know, and really that this is a powerful, for me, point about what you're saying, which is that for the most part, people nod their heads all the time, and I think to myself, no, then they think that they've got it, but not at all. They will go the next minute. They will say, and the future is for, and about getting to tomorrow and doing something, preparing, create desirable, probable, betting, precautionary, and then the ability to just give up on the future, to not treat the future as if it needs to be known or somebody needs to know it. And I'll stop on this point, which is that I think, in part, let's call it the underdevelopment of our capacity to listen, reflects this same dynamic, which is that the whole ensemble perpetuates power. Meaning, one of the crucial ways to reproduce the past is to make it difficult for people to hear anything other than the future is good for creating, colonizing tomorrow. And then I turn to my leader or somebody, because I can't do it technocratically or from elite perspective, to give me the future that I then use. And so we instrumentalize the narratives, the future, and our capacity to listen in ways which diminish. And that's the poverty part of it, which I don't want, not the point to debate here. But I think that really, I, in any case, find that we have a much bigger problem than we think we do. But that's just maybe my perspective. I'm sure that this is something we can continue to discuss along the way. Just any word you want to have? Yeah.
One of the recurrent refrains of the book is both and this, it manifests primarily in relation to both scientific evidence and the importance of other forms of knowledge rather than either or. But I wonder if it might be brought to what I know you're worrying away at as well, which is decisions have to be made, and we've seen this in the pandemic, based on modeling, imagination of, anticipation, whatever word you want to use, the future. Particularly decisions by people who are in positions of authority, positions of public service or democratic election, will have a responsibility in this instance to the public health of their citizens. So I think some instrumentalization is necessary, yeah, but that doesn't mean that we can't have both and I see behind you the wonderful polls that were at the last international event I was at in Paris at UNESCO in December 2019, of having also the disruptive, also recognizing the unknown. What does that mean for the decisions that we make? What does that mean in terms of shaking our certitude in ways that might force us to think differently? I mean, one of the reasons that I love literature so much is because it is a site that in fact is generative and brilliant because it is enabled to maintain and countenance the mutually exclusive. Both and, even if those things might seem to be opposites, can coexist in literature. And I just wonder what might happen if they could also coexist in other, perhaps more practical realms, such as thinking about the future. How productive is it to go either or, to say, we've had too much of this for millennia, therefore now we only need this? I know that's not what you're implying, but that, yeah, balance. I don't know if Claire has anything else to add. No, okay, yeah.
Great. Well, could go on for a long time. Lots of things on my mind here. This is wonderful. Please open the floor to other interventions, people who want to ask a question. I noticed Ilias asked a question earlier on in the chat. You can also just put your questions in the chat. Please feel free to do that. Anybody want to come forward? Don't be shy. And by the way, if you don't come in soon, I'm gonna jump back in because I've got more that I want to think, to add to the mix.
We've got one from Bjorn, thank you. Sorry, I have been running throughout the whole pandemic a massive seminar series on the history of AI. So I've become very adept at the whole Zoom chat talky dynamic. So is there any storytelling analysis of the financial crisis 2008? There is. Katie Shaw's book Crunch Lit would be the place to start, I think. There's a whole I have a master's student currently doing his dissertation on cinematic representations of the crisis. So kind of the way in which not anticipation of the crisis is involved with stories, but the way in which the stories that have been told after it perpetuate certain ideas about the complexity or unknowability of finances. As a student who's come into a literature department, having worked in the financial industry for a decade, and very interested in what he thinks are kind of misleading narratives about finance, which primarily have come across in the movies that have been made. So they would be the kind of two things I would suggest looking at. Yeah.
Sarah, I don't know if you agree, but the Robert Schiller book, which is a very different type of book because he's an economist, looks certainly at financial crises during the 20th century. And so the crash, the Wall Street crash, for example, and just begins to explore what kinds of narratives in that context they would be badged as non-fiction, although of course many of them were wrong about what was going to happen or what was not going to happen economically in the US. So I think if you were thinking about the 2008 crisis, you might also want to look at the way that he's approached thinking about these earlier economic crises.
Coming, Ilias, to some of your comments in the chat. I mean, I think we've touched on some of it in the preceding discussion, but I think it's worth reiterating that story listening isn't about individuals, and it's not about it. So we spend quite a lot of time, much to Claire's amusement in my first draft, which is very ranty, dismantling the kind of the traditional justification for the use or importance of stories, which is, that they make you more empathetic. So that if everybody in a certain government department read a nice short story before they went into their meeting, that they would, make better decisions. Like, it just outrages me. And I have a joke in another essay that, anybody who thinks that reading or imbibing stories makes you a better person just needs to come to an English faculty departmental meeting. Like, we literally study these stories for a living, and we are not all impeccably moral and ethical beings. So there was a real desire for me, in a way that's kind of also a starting point for me, was going, but they do have value, and they do have cognitive value, but how do we develop and create, viable and rigorous different arguments for that? And moving from the individual to the collective is really important, because it's not about a decision maker having their individual point of view changed or their own identity changed, or although it may have that effect, but it's about, as Claire says, this kind of, I don't know, if I've never used this word before, and Claire, you can tell me if I'm wrong, but a kind of position of neutrality from which you recognize that what you need is to gather as much as is possible or feasible in the time allowed or with the resources you have, evidence and knowledge that enables you to understand the system in relation to which you're operating, and hopefully therefore make better decisions or recommendations in relation to it. So it's a kind of weird thing to say that we don't care about the individual. It is wonderful if collateral of this is that individuals themselves break down their narrative lock-in, individuals themselves become more narratively literate. But the key takeaway is that the collective operations of understanding and evidence and decision making are enriched. Does that sound right, Claire? Yeah.
Absolutely. I was trying to think about the practical ways of doing that, because I mean, another strand is that this is because of the evolution of digital humanities and different forms of new forms of evidence. You could in principle begin to get towards being able to take a kind of sweep across every story on a particular subject within some framing in a way that might not have been possible kind of 20 or 30 years ago, and that would be fascinating. And you'd have to have a really, I mean, you'd have to create a mechanism, wouldn't you, that would sort of abstract the bits of story from their contexts, and then also sort of then filter them somehow to work out what was useful. I'm literally trying to think, you know, if a UN program or a government somewhere said, right, fine, I absolutely agree with this. I want to know what story listening will tell me about my anticipations of land use in the context of net zero targets. Go, you know, what do you do? And actually, I think you could construct something that was really systematic and that drew in the kind of range of stories that Sarah's beginning to talk about. And it wouldn't be nothing to do with what you as the person leading that actually believed to be the most important stories or the most attractive ones. And then, I mean, of course, none of us are really neutral, but that so whatever happened with that would in no way be, you know, completely objective or anything like that. But nevertheless, it would almost certainly not be what you would start with if you were conducting a more kind of deliberately led pro-policy solution approach to asking what the relevant stories were. Anyhow, I think that's a long way of saying I think there might be some really exciting practical things that you could do that would operationalize some of what Sarah was just saying.
Yeah, and to pick up Ilias, you'll come back in the chat. It's therefore not about a mental apparatus. It's about advisory system and evidence gathering apparatus. And of course, these, and we talk about this a little in the book, differ across different nations and different regions. We know the UK system very well through Claire's direct involvement in it. And one of the things we're really interested in is learning about how other structures of government and other areas, what systems they have for knowledge gathering and how story listening might or might not fit within those apparatus.
Picking up on this thread, which I think is very interesting, and of course makes me think about what we do with Futures Literacy Labs. I mean, one of the concerns has been that there are certain things that are invisible. So let's generate the hypothesis that you could become the story listening today is, as you've argued, I mean, is shaped by all of these elements, including the proposition that we really care about choice. And in fact, the hero and then we're really looking in all of these things for where are the choices and what are the consequences. And we're looking, you know, for destiny and we're looking for tragedy and comedy, etc. And these biases make it, in fact, impossible for us to talk about or demonstrate or produce evidence of something else. And it's been one of the really fascinating aspects of Futures Literacy Labs, which is that it is exceedingly difficult to get people to manifest, to provide evidence of something which they are not aware that they're capable of doing and don't think about doing themselves. But you can create the conditions, and this of course is a way of biasing the evidence, so I'm aware of that, but you can create the conditions in which they will manifest anticipation for emergence. They will say, you know what? I think I'm missing a word here. I actually don't know how to describe the world around me, because if I change my idea of the future, the words I'm using are not adequate. And that's something that I think is really very, you know, that's triggered, this conversation's triggered this in me, is that we have a huge challenge to generate evidence of fundamentally other ways of story listening that people do not yet have or practice. Because like in the question, one of the questions there, you know, that we come at this with already a built-in, and I make this argument about anticipatory systems, which is I say that children are testing very simple anticipatory systems, which are very causal and are very survival oriented. I cry, I get fed, I cross the street, I look for a car, etc. But when you get into adolescence and you confront anticipatory systems which are ambivalent, ambiguous, emergent, complex, such as who will like me, why will they like me, what will make me happy, how will I be happy, you have no points of reference. And in the current context, we're put into these situations where they simply reinforce your deterministic anticipatory system. The teacher knows, your parents know, the linear causality, get a good degree, you get a good job, have a happy family, all fill in the blanks, and don't exercise your ambiguous, ambivalent, open, emergent, novel anticipatory systems. So I'm really wondering this about story listening, is that how would we detect what's invisible now? What do we build in the way of a scientific method to expose these story listening dimensions that are largely invisible in the world of today?
I kind of want to turn it back on you, which is all of your examples there about anticipatory assumptions and systems in relation to the individual. So I guess the question back at you is futures literacy only something that an individual can develop? Because I'm much more interested in what it would mean for a system to become futures literate. And for us, because then you get away from these questions about, to some extent, about personal bias. And I know that Claire and I are working in the book with a model of good governance, I guess, where you have people who are genuinely trying to make the best decisions that they can make in the interests of the people that they serve. And I'm not naive enough to to think that that is actually the case everywhere. But if you work with that model, then some of these questions become less pertinent, and other ones become more pertinent, which is, as a the board of a business, of a corporation, or the decision-making body of a certain government, how can we be more futures literate, and how can we be more narratively literate, and what structures do we have in place that mitigate against our own illiteracy in both of those senses, that enable us precisely, and this comes back to your question, to access the things that are invisible to us. So I think that's why us as individuals, and therefore I guess us as a system or a collective. So that would be where I think story listening fits, is this the need to draw on experts and the widest range of possible evidence that you can find, in order to, remember the picture that Claire had on one of our earlier slides, in order to multiply the number of different perspectives that you get on a system, and therefore get a different and better view on that system.
Claire, I don't know if you want to jump in on this. The aggregation issue, so the individual versus the collective, I kind of want to try and escape from that as much as I can, in the sense that I think the conception of agency, which is both macro and micro, which is both the individual and the organizational or societal, is actually kind of clouds some of my thinking, precisely because I want to then get at the improvement issue. How do you make sure that the bottom and the top communicate, or how do you make sure that the overall system can make sense or collect the diversity of different points of view, etc. And try and find a way to understand this from assemblage perspective and from a relational perspective, an entanglement perspective. And I'm not nearly capable of kind of unpacking all that and making sense of it. But I really am very sensitive. So I agree with you, Sarah, that this is not an individual issue. We experience it in the evidence gathering process, largely through the effort to get people to exercise their collective intelligence, which is one avenue into the more collective side of it, because basically we can't get people to expose their anticipatory systems and assumptions just by getting them to spout. I mean, you can, but it's not very effective. you can do textual analysis and you can look at the existing ways of instrumentalizing the future. But again, it's, you know, it's rather the conclusions foregone. There was already that purpose in mind for the policy document. So the question becomes, how do you begin to go beyond those? And we have been using collective intelligence, which I think really reinforces the message that you're sending, which is that we are locked in a bunch of different ways and from a bunch of different pillars into ways of just, you know, we're deaf to collectively, here I'm speaking, to other ways of organizing. And I push it. It was what I meant about monumentalism, is that I think we're really, you know, finding it very, very hard to break out of something that has dominated human societies for a very, very, very long time. And that this is, you know, not that thankfully, in a sense, the planet, without any, you know, forethought, malice, consciousness, or whatever, is simply saying, you have distanced yourself. You cannot hear the forest. You can no longer hear the forest. You can't hear the story of our collective, because you've just blocked your way of hearing, because you're looking for the choices. You're looking for, the whole society has conceptualized agency in such a way that everything fits into it. So I mean, I'm thrilled, but sorry to get carried away.
So I mean, Sarah's much more expert in this than I am, but I mean, isn't the examples of existing stories that give voices to forests, and there isn't the fact that story listening would force people to listen to those stories? I mean, is that not part of helping with exactly what you're? And those stories are not common. You know, you're more likely to be a hunter in the forest, but actually there are stories from the perspective of a forest, say,
Yeah.
or a mountain or a river. So we're, I mean, I think we would hope humbly that that's exactly the kind of thing. And I suppose part of it is that, and I mean, this again, there's more the practitioner, but for me, part of this is, it would be great if, as opposed to having to convince somebody else, it might be an individual, or it might be somebody in power, or it might be a group of peoples, that it's important to listen to forests, which frankly, even as I'm saying it, I can feel, you know, the pushback, yeah, in most circles that I inhabit. I've got a way of coming at this now, which will require them ultimately to listen to forests, but they don't have to realize, they don't have to start from that point of view, because this is actually saying listen to other people's listening to forests or stories about forests, but you know, without getting too recursive. So I think that once again, one's kind of considers story listening as really systematic and really reaching out, it does exactly what you say, because most of the lock-in is because of the dominance of certain types of stories within certain types of groups, and actually you do not have to go very far. I mean, often even I would argue into people's kind of less guarded spaces, in other words, to the things that they do in their, or read, or in watching their leisure time, as opposed to when they feel they're on show, or you know, that actually there's a huge wide range of stories out there to be listened to that would really be disruptive, and all we have to do is listen. I mean, there'll be new stories to be told too, but it's legitimizing the listening. Sarah, did I miss no? Okay.
Yeah. Spot on. I'm with you all the way. I mean, I wasn't trying to say that it's impossible or to be pessimistic in some sense like that, but there are times when it feels that the dominant.
It's a hard. I mean, it's hard.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know if how many have read the Richard Powers Over story, but I mean, it's a pretty pessimistic conclusion about where humans are going to land in that one. You know, and I have to say, and by the way, this, I mean, just we're the last few seconds, and I'm so grateful for you to have done this, but you know, there is a version of this kind of thinking which says, look, we've lived within a certain band of the climate in a sort of stability on this planet, and in some senses we're traumatized by the fact that it will no longer be in that stable band. But what it means for humans to live in another climate, is something that we're, resisting a lot exploring, although the science fiction is getting there. But I think that one of the reasons that it's so difficult to do that is because we really can't. We have such a hard time hearing the forest, and understanding that we are the forest, in fact, and so therefore we're just the same. And as the planet changes, we'll change, and the whole thing's just changing together. So
yeah,
anyhow,
just to come in on that at the end, I'm always very suspicious of the third person collective pronoun we, and because who's the we, and we do talk in the book and point to and hopefully do some work to foreground a lot of work that's going on in Indigenous studies. For instance, there's Donald, who talks about ethical relationality, that not everybody has stopped hearing the forest. And there's certain types of human beings that have stopped hearing it, and that have stopped listening to and recognizing other collections of human beings that haven't stopped listening and haven't stopped hearing. And that again is about coming back to recognizing the limits of certain we's and listening to the things that other we's haven't forgotten.
100%. Absolutely. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Claire. I hope everybody enjoyed this. I think this was exactly what I was dreaming of from the point of view of getting these webinars going and transforming the future, anticipation of the 21st century, rethinking it together. So heartfelt thank you, and looking forward to continuing the conversation.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, everybody.
Thank you so much. Yeah.
Have a good evening, everybody.
Bye.